The dawn of December 1941 brought a storm that few in Southeast Asia were prepared for. The Japanese advance across Malaya and Singapore was swift, almost unreal in its precision, leaving Allied forces stunned and civilians scrambling for safety. The fall of Singapore, often called the Gibraltar of the East, shocked the world and marked the beginning of an unprecedented ordeal for tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. They were no longer soldiers fighting on their own terms, they had become prisoners of war, swept into a system of captivity that would test the limits of human endurance. The initial moments after surrender were filled with disbelief, confusion, and fear. Men who had trained for battle suddenly found themselves surrounded, disarmed, and marched into an unknown fate, unaware that the Japanese forces had already begun planning a massive project, the Burma Railway, that would demand unimaginable toil. The marches from the battlefield to prison camps were the first taste of the harsh reality. Thousands of soldiers, weary from combat and demoralized by defeat, were herded along roads and jungle paths, their pace dictated by guards wielding sticks and rifles. Hunger gnawed at them, water was scarce, and the oppressive tropical heat sapped strength with every step. Men stumbled, fell, and were beaten for lagging behind, their injuries ignored. Local civilians often watched silently, some offering small gestures of aid, while others turned away, fearful of Japanese retribution. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers accustomed to discipline and camaraderie now faced a relentless environment where survival itself was a struggle. Upon arrival at the first camps, prisoners confronted a landscape that was both alien and menacing. Bamboo huts with thatched roofs, sometimes barely standing, lined muddy pathways, while jungle encroached on every side, bringing with it insects, snakes, and the constant threat of disease. Food was meager, a thin rice gruel, sometimes supplemented with scraps of vegetables or fish. Malnutrition quickly set in, and the earliest cases of dysentery, malaria, and beriberi appeared. Sanitation was minimal, latrines were crude, often no more than holes dug in the ground. The first weeks were a crucible, testing the limits of resilience, as prisoners attempted to adjust to confinement, harsh discipline, and the relentless unpredictability of camp life. The organization of the camps was deliberate and ruthless. Japanese officers established strict hierarchies, with guards enforcing obedience through fear. Roll calls were frequent, and any infraction, however minor, could result in beatings or worse. Officers from the Allied side struggled to maintain morale among their men, negotiating with Japanese captors when possible and trying to preserve some semblance of order. Small acts of defiance, a shared joke, a secret swap of rations, a whispered message became lifelines of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Yet these gestures were dangerous, punishment was swift, and the consequences could be fatal. As the weeks passed, prisoners began to witness the arrival of Asian laborers conscripted from Thailand, Malaya, and Burma. These men, often pressed into service under similar threats of violence, were integrated into work parties alongside POWs. The dynamics between the groups were complex, while language and cultural differences created barriers, shared suffering fostered bonds of mutual support. POWs learned to rely on local laborers for guidance in navigating the jungle, improvising solutions to scarcity, and maintaining a fragile morale. The sight of these men, equally malnourished and exhausted yet unbroken in spirit, reinforced the stark reality that survival depended not only on physical strength but also on human connection. Rumors of the Burma Railway project circulated quietly among the prisoners. They spoke of a massive construction effort, stretching hundreds of kilometers through jungles, rivers, and mountains, intended to connect Thailand and Burma for Japanese military logistics. The scale of the undertaking was almost unimaginable, and whispers of the conditions: harsh labor, minimal rations, disease, and death spread rapidly. Yet, despite fear, there was a grim understanding among POWs: this railway would define their captivity. Those who survived it might return home, but only if they could endure months of backbreaking work, unrelenting discipline, and the constant shadow of mortality. The early days in camp were also marked by psychological manipulation. Prisoners quickly recognized the calculated nature of Japanese control. Terror, exhaustion, and uncertainty were as much a weapon as rifles or bayonets. News from the outside world was sparse, censored, or entirely absent. Men relied on letters from home, rumors, or fragments of Allied broadcasts, clinging to hope while confronting a reality where hope was deliberately undermined. Those who fell ill, those who broke under pressure, or those who resisted faced immediate consequences, reinforcing the pervasive message that survival depended on obedience, endurance, and adaptability. Despite these harsh realities, human resilience began to emerge. Officers and enlisted men formed support networks, sharing food, medicine, and knowledge of disease management. POWs improvised medical treatment using local herbs and scavenged supplies, and those with skills, doctors, engineers, carpenters, became invaluable. Stories of courage circulated quietly: a soldier helping another traverse a river swollen with rain, men carrying the sick through the mud, or organizing secret lessons to maintain morale. These small acts, seemingly insignificant, became the scaffolding of endurance, proving that even in the most oppressive environments, solidarity could provide a lifeline. As the weeks turned into months, the prisoners acclimated to the rhythms of captivity, though acclimation was never comfort. Labor assignments varied, sometimes involving clearing jungle, constructing rudimentary paths, or preparing the railway foundations. Each day was a battle against fatigue, hunger, and disease, and each night brought the dread of the next day's punishment or accident. Letters home, often censored and delayed, became precious connections to a world beyond the camp, reminders that life continued elsewhere and that survival was not in vain. The capture and initial march to the camps were not merely physical trials, they were also a profound psychological ordeal. Soldiers who had once commanded respect on the battlefield were stripped of rank and agency. Men accustomed to structure found themselves at the mercy of arbitrary authority. Those with hope clung to it fiercely, those who succumbed to despair often did not survive the relentless cycles of work, malnutrition, and disease. The Burma Railway camps, in their infancy, had already begun to test every dimension of human resilience: physical, mental, and moral, laying the foundation for the grueling months of construction and labor that would define the prisoners' wartime experience. In retrospect, the initial capture and march were more than a prelude to the horrors of forced labor. They were a crucible, forging bonds, revealing human frailty, and highlighting the stark contrast between oppressor and oppressed. The march into captivity transformed soldiers into survivors, introducing them to the relentless machinery of Japanese forced labor while planting the seeds of endurance, ingenuity, and solidarity that would be vital in the grueling months to come. The story of these first days reminds us that in war, survival begins not on the battlefield but in the quiet, harrowing moments of uncertainty, when men are stripped of agency and forced to confront the raw realities of captivity. Life in the Burma Railway camps. The first rays of dawn in the camps along the Burma Railway revealed a scene of exhaustion, despair, and quiet determination. Bamboo huts barely shielded men from the sweltering tropical heat, while muddy paths snaked through thick jungle that seemed to close in with every step. For prisoners of war, each day was a repetition of struggle, waking before sunrise to the harsh calls of Japanese guards, performing backbreaking labor, and enduring relentless disease and hunger. Yet, within this grim routine, men found ways to survive, adapt, and assert small measures of dignity in a system designed to strip them entirely of humanity. Food or the lack of it was the first test of endurance. Rations were pitiful, a thin gruel of rice, sometimes mixed with small scraps of vegetables or occasional fish. Protein was rare, and fruit or meat was considered a luxury, appearing only sporadically, often confiscated by guards before it reached the prisoners. Malnutrition was rampant, bodies wasted away under the twin pressures of hard labor and inadequate sustenance. POWs developed creative methods to supplement their diets, foraging in the jungle, trading with local laborers, or even clandestinely catching fish in nearby streams. These small victories, though insufficient to restore health, became vital acts of resistance and survival. Disease thrived in the camps, exploiting weakness and overcrowding. Dysentery, malaria, cholera, beriberi, and tropical ulcers became everyday companions, claiming lives slowly and painfully. Medical supplies were scarce, and even trained doctors were forced to improvise, using local herbs and makeshift treatments. Despite these limitations, POW doctors and orderlies worked tirelessly, often risking punishment to care for the sick. Hygiene was almost non-existent, water was contaminated, latrines were inadequate, and bathing was a rare privilege. The presence of disease transformed the simplest tasks into monumental challenges, as men struggled to move, lift, or carry under conditions that would have broken even the strongest. The daily work routine was relentless. From sunrise to sunset, prisoners and forced laborers were sent to clear jungle, dig foundations, build embankments, or lay tracks. Heavy timber, rock, and earth were moved by hand, often with rudimentary tools. Streams had to be diverted, tunnels blasted through solid rock, and treacherous hillsides carved into passable slopes. Accidents were common: landslides, falling trees, collapsing trenches, and mishandling of explosives claimed lives and limbs alike. Japanese guards enforced efficiency with brutal discipline, punishing delays, mistakes, or rest with beatings, imprisonment, or execution. The physical strain, compounded by hunger and disease, made survival a daily gamble. Interactions between Allied POWs and Asian laborers added another layer of complexity to camp life. Thai, Burmese, and Malayan laborers were often as malnourished and overworked as the POWs, yet their knowledge of local terrain, plants, and survival techniques proved invaluable. Relationships were forged cautiously, sharing food, trading small items, or learning how to avoid accidents in dangerous work zones. Mutual aid became a form of silent resistance, a way to maintain humanity in a system designed to erase it. At times, cultural misunderstandings led to tension, but the shared experience of suffering often bridged divides, creating bonds that transcended language and nationality. Psychological strain was omnipresent. Prisoners faced constant fear of punishment, uncertainty about the future, and the despair of witnessing death around them. The monotony of camp life was punctuated by moments of terror, sudden roll calls, random beatings, or the removal of men for punishment details. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by insects, heat, or the cries of the sick. Isolation from the outside world compounded mental suffering. News of the war reached them slowly, often filtered or censored, leaving men to cling to hope as the only lifeline. Despite these pressures, small acts of normalcy, singing, reading, writing, or playing games provided crucial psychological relief, offering moments of respite in an otherwise relentless environment. Hierarchy and order within the camps were delicate. POW officers tried to maintain discipline, organize labor, and protect their men, negotiating when possible with Japanese guards. Leadership within the prisoner population was both a privilege and a burden, officers had to balance compliance with survival against the moral responsibility to care for their men. Among enlisted men, camaraderie and cooperation were vital. Sharing food, helping carry the sick, or working together to complete dangerous tasks became essential strategies for survival. These informal networks often determined who lived and who did not, reinforcing the idea that solidarity could outweigh brute strength in enduring hardship. Punishment was arbitrary and brutal. Falling behind during work details could mean hours of beatings, minor mistakes were punished with confinement or execution. Public punishments served as warnings to others, reinforcing the omnipresence of fear. Yet prisoners adapted, learning to anticipate and mitigate danger. Small strategies maintaining pace, sharing workloads, or helping weaker men became essential survival skills. The tension between fear and ingenuity defined life in the camps, highlighting the human capacity to endure even under extreme oppression. Religion, superstition, and rituals played a subtle role in coping. Men turned to prayer, meditation, or personal rituals to maintain a sense of control. Secret ceremonies or readings of sacred texts offered spiritual sustenance, while storytelling and recollections of home reminded prisoners of a world beyond the jungle. Humor, though risky, was another crucial outlet. Jokes, banter, and shared laughter became acts of defiance, creating small pockets of normalcy in a life otherwise dominated by fear and exhaustion. Letters, when they arrived, were treasured. Even heavily censored communications from home brought hope, grounding prisoners in the reality that they were remembered and awaited. Men often guarded these letters jealously, reading them repeatedly, drawing strength from the words, and passing them among comrades in whispered readings. Such connections, fragile as they were, reinforced resilience and helped prisoners maintain a sense of identity beyond the dehumanizing conditions imposed by captivity. In retrospect, life in the Burma Railway camps during the early months of construction was a daily confrontation with mortality. Every meal, every task, every interaction could mean survival or death. Yet within this extreme environment, prisoners demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, solidarity, and adaptability. Their ability to navigate hunger, disease, labor, and fear reveals a complex tapestry of endurance, human spirit, and moral negotiation. The camps were not only places of suffering but also crucibles in which courage, resourcefulness, and the bonds of shared humanity were forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances. The construction of the Death Railway. The dense jungles of Thailand and Burma concealed one of the most harrowing feats of forced labor in history, the construction of the Burma Railway. For the thousands of Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers conscripted into its making, the project was a nightmare that transformed verdant wilderness into a landscape of death and despair. From the very first days, it was clear that this railway would demand not only physical labor of extraordinary intensity but also mental endurance, ingenuity, and sheer willpower in the face of relentless cruelty. Every day began before sunrise. Prisoners were awakened by the shrill whistle of Japanese guards, often before they had fully recovered from the previous day's work. Fatigued men were herded to the work sites sometimes miles away carrying minimal supplies and often with open sores or untreated illnesses. Labor tasks were assigned without consideration for age, injury, or skill. Clearing jungle meant hacking through dense undergrowth with machetes under oppressive heat, while engineers and laborers tackled dangerous tasks such as blasting tunnels through solid rock or constructing treacherous embankments along steep hillsides. The risk of accidents was constant. Collapsing trees, falling boulders, and poorly secured scaffolds claimed lives daily. Bridges were among the deadliest sections of the railway. Timber had to be felled, floated, and assembled over fast-flowing rivers with primitive tools and little guidance. The most famous of these, the bridge over the River Kwai, became emblematic of the scale and suffering involved. Men labored for hours under scorching sun or torrential rain, carrying heavy beams and laying tracks while guarding soldiers watched, often striking those who faltered. Many prisoners lost their lives to drowning, exhaustion, or beatings. The combination of unskilled labor, brutal oversight, and unforgiving terrain ensured that mortality rates were extraordinarily high, particularly among the weakest and least experienced workers. Tunnels presented another layer of horror. Carved through limestone hills with rudimentary tools and explosives, these passages became death traps for those inside. Inadequate ventilation led to suffocating conditions, collapsing rock and mismanaged explosives claimed scores of lives. Prisoners were forced to work in shifts, often for 12 to 16 hours at a stretch, with only brief rests. The psychological impact of working underground, in near-total darkness, surrounded by the sounds of collapsing stone and cries of injured men, was profound. Fear, exhaustion, and despair became as dangerous as any physical hazard. Disease ran rampant on the work sites. Malaria-infested swamps, stagnant water, and exposure to tropical heat accelerated the spread of illness. Dysentery, cholera, beriberi, and infections from untreated wounds were constant killers. Medical facilities were minimal, with doctors and orderlies improvising treatments from scarce supplies. The lack of sanitation and proper nutrition exacerbated suffering, and every day of labor became a confrontation with mortality. Men witnessed friends and colleagues fall ill or die, often helpless to intervene, while the railway's construction marched relentlessly onward. The Japanese command structure reinforced the brutality. Officers emphasized speed and efficiency over human life. Roll calls were frequent, and punishments were harsh and arbitrary. Falling behind on work quotas could result in hours of beatings, confinement, or execution. Men were forced to adopt extreme measures just to survive, sharing rations clandestinely, forming human chains to transport materials, or improvising tools from scavenged wood and metal. Ingenious adaptations, like makeshift stretchers, improvised irrigation to prevent trench collapse, and secret medical remedies, became essential survival strategies. Despite these conditions, bonds formed among prisoners. Shared labor, suffering, and ingenuity fostered a fragile camaraderie that became critical to enduring the relentless workload. Men learned to anticipate each other's needs, assist with the physically weakest, and provide moral support. The small victories, successfully hauling timber, constructing a bridge segment, or tending to the sick without being caught, offered a sense of agency in an environment designed to strip it away. Humor and storytelling, often whispered at night or exchanged during short breaks, became essential tools of psychological survival, helping men maintain identity and hope in a setting dominated by cruelty. Asian laborers played an equally vital role, though their suffering was often even greater due to inadequate food, harsher treatment, and lack of external advocacy. POWs sometimes acted as intermediaries, sharing techniques or resources, but cultural and linguistic barriers complicated communication. Nevertheless, shared adversity forged unexpected alliances. Lessons learned from local knowledge navigating swamps, identifying edible plants, or predicting weather patterns saved lives. These interactions demonstrated that survival depended not only on individual strength but on cooperation, resourcefulness, and the recognition of shared humanity across cultural divides. Work on the death railway was relentless, but the environment added its own merciless challenges. Monsoon rains transformed paths into rivers of mud, flooded trenches, and destabilized embankments. Tropical storms, heat exhaustion, and venomous wildlife created constant hazards. The jungle itself seemed an adversary, pushing men toward collapse with its oppressive humidity, swarms of insects, and creeping vegetation that reclaimed labor efforts overnight. Each day was a battle against nature as well as against the imposed labor, and only the most resilient, resourceful, and lucky survived. Death became an unavoidable reality. Estimates suggest that over 12,000 Allied POWs and more than 90,000 Asian laborers perished during construction. Graves were often shallow, marked only by simple wooden stakes, or left unmarked entirely. Survivors carried the trauma of witnessing constant mortality, creating a shared understanding that life was fragile, and survival a triumph in itself. The railway advanced relentlessly despite these losses, a monument to both human ingenuity and the extreme costs exacted by war and forced labor. Yet amid despair, acts of courage and ingenuity emerged. Prisoners organized secret education sessions, improvised musical instruments, and even conducted small religious ceremonies. Stories of bravery risking punishment to rescue the injured, sharing scarce medicine, or protecting weaker men from abuse served as testaments to human resilience. The construction of the railway was not solely a narrative of cruelty, it was also a chronicle of solidarity, endurance, and quiet resistance in the face of overwhelming adversity. The physical railway, when completed, stretched over 415 kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain in Southeast Asia. It connected Bangkok to Rangoon, a feat of engineering accomplished at an incalculable human cost. The Death Railway became a symbol of suffering, resilience, and the extremes to which human beings could be pushed under coercion. Its legacy is preserved in survivor accounts, memorials, and historical studies, reminding future generations of both the cruelty of forced labor and the strength of human endurance. Liberation, aftermath, and legacy. By the middle of 1945, the war in the Pacific was drawing to a close, and the prisoners of the Burma Railway finally glimpsed the possibility of liberation. For men who had endured months or years of relentless forced labor, disease, hunger, and abuse, the news of Japan's surrender brought a mixture of relief, disbelief, and cautious hope. The jungle that had been a prison for so long now became a corridor to freedom, yet liberation was only the beginning of a new struggle, one that would test physical endurance, psychological resilience, and the capacity to reintegrate into a world that had moved forward while they were trapped in suffering. The surrender of Japanese forces prompted the release of POWs and the gradual dismantling of the camps. Allied forces, advancing through Southeast Asia, reached remote locations, often finding survivors in appalling conditions. Men had lost significant weight, suffered from untreated illnesses, and in many cases, were close to death. Those who survived required immediate medical intervention, food, water, shelter, and care for disease and injuries. Medical teams worked tirelessly, often under difficult conditions, to stabilize men who had been weakened by months of malnutrition, tropical illnesses, and physical exhaustion. The challenge was not only to save lives but to restore hope, identity, and dignity to individuals who had been dehumanized by captivity. The liberation process was chaotic. Camps were scattered along hundreds of kilometers of jungle, and communication between Allied units and survivors was limited. Prisoners, disoriented after years of confinement, faced difficulties navigating terrain, accessing food, and reconnecting with fellow soldiers. Some had been separated from their units for months, relying on chance encounters or local laborers for survival. The process of reunification was often fraught with anxiety and uncertainty, families had no certainty of survival, and the emotional weight of reconnecting with the world they had left behind was overwhelming. Physical rehabilitation was an immediate concern. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and tropical diseases left many survivors incapable of walking or standing for extended periods. Hospitals in liberated areas were overwhelmed, and makeshift treatment centers became essential. Nutritional rehabilitation was gradual, as sudden refeeding could cause severe complications. Careful management of infection, disease, and injury was necessary, and the medical personnel who treated survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding health in men who had been systematically weakened by starvation and labor. This process, often painstakingly slow, revealed both the fragility and resilience of the human body. Psychological trauma was another lasting legacy. Years of forced labor, isolation, and brutality had left deep scars. Survivors recounted recurring nightmares, flashbacks, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The memory of witnessing fellow prisoners die, of brutal beatings, and the relentless uncertainty of survival haunted many for the rest of their lives. Psychologists and military doctors began to recognize the need for mental health interventions, though in many cases, support was limited or delayed. Communities and families became crucial in helping survivors reintegrate, providing emotional support and stability as men learned to navigate civilian life after the extreme conditions of captivity. War crimes trials followed liberation, holding Japanese officers accountable for the atrocities committed along the railway. Investigations documented neglect, brutality, and the deliberate exposure of prisoners and laborers to lethal working conditions. Several officers and camp commanders were tried and convicted for murder, abuse, and violations of the laws of war. These trials served multiple purposes, delivering justice, establishing historical records, and providing a form of closure for survivors and families. Yet, for many, the emotional and physical wounds remained, and justice, while important, could not erase the suffering endured. The legacy of the Burma Railway camps extends far beyond the immediate wartime experience. Memorials, museums, and literature preserve the memory of prisoners and laborers alike. Sites such as Kanchanaburi in Thailand commemorate both the lives lost and the resilience of survivors. Survivor testimonies, diaries, and photographs provide invaluable records of daily life, the scale of suffering, and the small acts of courage and solidarity that allowed men to endure. These narratives challenge future generations to confront the realities of forced labor, the consequences of military aggression, and the complex interplay between human cruelty and resilience. Asian laborers' stories, long overshadowed by the focus on Allied POWs, have increasingly gained recognition. Tens of thousands of conscripted civilians from Thailand, Burma, and Malaya perished, their contributions and suffering integral to the completion of the railway. Modern scholarship emphasizes the shared experience of these groups, highlighting the universal costs of forced labor and the moral imperative to remember all victims. Commemorations and historical studies have begun to integrate these perspectives, ensuring a more inclusive understanding of the railway's human toll. The psychological and social impact of the camps extended into post-war life. Many survivors struggled with reintegration into societies that had moved forward without them. Relationships, employment, and social roles had to be rebuilt, often while coping with lingering trauma. Support networks, veterans associations, and community groups became vital, offering both practical aid and emotional solidarity. For many, the process of telling their story through memoirs, interviews, or participation in memorial projects became an essential aspect of healing, allowing them to assert control over narratives that had once been dictated entirely by captors. Education and remembrance became central to ensuring that the horrors of the Burma Railway were not forgotten. Schools, historical societies, and media have highlighted survivor accounts, using them to teach lessons about human rights, ethics in warfare, and the resilience of the human spirit. Documentaries, novels, and films, while sometimes dramatized, help convey the scale of suffering and the courage required to endure it. The railway itself, partially preserved as a heritage site, serves as a tangible reminder of both human ingenuity and human cruelty, illustrating the stark duality inherent in this history. Ultimately, the Burma Railway camps are a testament to the extremes of human experience. They reveal the capacity for cruelty, the destructive potential of war, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Simultaneously, they illuminate human resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity under conditions that tested every boundary of physical and mental endurance. The story of liberation and aftermath underscores that survival was only the first stage. Rebuilding health, reclaiming identity, and seeking justice formed the long, challenging journey that followed. The camp's legacy continues to resonate globally. Commemorations honor both Allied and Asian laborers, while historical scholarship ensures that the lessons of the railway remain accessible. The railway's physical remnants, combined with survivor testimonies, serve as enduring evidence of the consequences of unchecked power and the capacity of individuals to endure unimaginable hardship. By studying and remembering this history, future generations can recognize both the depths of human cruelty and the strength of the human spirit, ensuring that the sacrifices of those who suffered are never forgotten. In the end, liberation was not a single moment but a process, a journey from physical captivity to emotional and psychological freedom. The Burma Railway camps, with their dense jungle, backbreaking labor, and relentless cruelty, tested the limits of human endurance. Yet, they also revealed that even in the darkest conditions, men could preserve dignity, form solidarity, and assert humanity. The story of the camps is not only a historical record of suffering but also a profound lesson in resilience, courage, and the enduring power of human connection in the face of unimaginable adversity.